I think it's safe to say after this, the next phase of the mini amp war has begun. Well, I guess enough of you asked for it because here it is, the Fosi V3 Mono. It has a lot of changes the community asked for, and so far I can say that I'm impressed. Let's get right into it. The original argument for these desktop size amps was the value. They're priced low in comparison to much of the competition, and provided a sound quality that was good for most, but not all people. I would have generally agreed the price to performance was the standout reason to buy these. They all had load dependence, in some cases quirky features and configurations, minimal inputs. In general, you got decent power, but you always had a few compromises. But what we're seeing now, like this Fosi V3 Mono for instance, is a new level of performance and polished packaging that is starting to separate them from the budget brands that have more compromises. The V3 Mono we're looking at today has low distortion levels that puts it up there with some of the best. The load dependence issues are basically eliminated, very adequate power levels, and even selectable inputs, RCA and XLR. Oh, and don't forget input signal detection for standby mode and a variable gain switch. It needs to be said that these are no longer just a good value buy, they're actually just good. I would actually say that the features and the performance take the front stage here. Combine that with the price, and it's really hard to argue against something like this if you're looking anywhere near this price point. Let me know below in the comments what you think of these changes and just the general direction of these amps. Is there anything in particular that's still holding you back from trying out one of these minis? And while you're down there, please throw me a like and subscribe. I really appreciate all of your support. These are monoblocks, obviously meaning you're gonna need two of these. There's no switch like previous models to change from stereo or mono. These share the same form factor as the original V3, although I would say it's more of a blend between the V3 and the newer ZA3 if anything. Taking a closer look at the exterior, we get rid of the volume knob and get what Mini asked for, a fixed volume solution. Removing the volume knob also changed how they handled powering on and off the units. On the ZA3, the volume knob was multifunction. You had to hold it down to power it on and off, which works fine, but created some inconveniences when it came to using these as monoblocks. With this, we actually get, in my opinion, the ideal solution. Actually, even better than I was expecting. No volume control, it's fixed, and the power is separated with three options: on, off, or auto. I wasn't expecting auto, but it's a feature that is very much appreciated on these. 10 minutes of idle time, and they simply just move into standby mode. The other switch in the front is to select between RCA and XLR, another upgrade over the original V3 that only offered an RCA connection. Venting and heat dissipation is handled slightly different than the V3, but very similar to the ZA3. They kept the latest design with the vents running down the sides. It's a good look, and even during the times I pushed these amps, I didn't bother to measure it because they were only getting warm to the touch. I'll show it later, but if you open these cases up, the case actually acts as the heatsink. It's simple, but pretty effective in my experience. Looking at the back, we have everything we'd expect. Power input, speaker terminals, XLR and RCA inputs. But just like the auto feature on the front, we had a surprise. This one actually has a selectable gain, which is new for Fosi amps. The options are 25 and 31 dB. It gives you a little more flexibility when it comes to pairing these up with various audio setups, which is great because I can see these being used in so many different situations. Desktop solutions for sure, the size is perfect, but I can easily see these moving over into some home theater configurations as well. Okay, let's get into a really important topic now. We finally have PFFB. That's post-filter feedback technology if you're unaware, and it really takes these amps to the next level, and in all reality starts to push these into a more premium market. Previous designs would run into the situation where you'd get a variability at the end of the frequency response, meaning that the frequency response from the amp could in some cases dramatically change depending on the speaker pairing you had hooked to it. One speaker may end up with treble several dB too high, or another possibility would be several dB too low. And that's likely the reason why we would get complaints from some about the highs on Class D amps coming across too bright, and other people seemingly unaffected. What we get after this implementation is essentially no impact to the frequency response, no matter if it's an 8 or 4 ohm load, which is exactly what everyone was looking for. This was always the easy knock you could apply to these amps, and how Mini justified spending more on premium designs. I won't sit here and say there's no longer an advantage to any of the premium amp designs out there. In many, but not all cases, there is a reason they cost more. But when you take the price of these and stack them up to the amps that cost multitudes more, things start to get really weird in a good way. Another interesting change on this one was the power supply options. I was sort of hoping that they'd send me two 48 volt 5 amp supplies, but what I actually received was a 48 volt 10 amp monster brick. One power supply, but an adapter to power both amps at once. I actually have multiple 48 volt 5 amp power supplies available to me, so I subjectively compared between the two separate supplies and the combined 48 volt 10 amp, and I honestly can't find any reason to push people into getting separate unless you plan to have each amp, near a speaker. Something like going with a long XLR cable, for example, and short with the speaker cable. Basically just a placement situation. But if these are at your desk, I didn't feel like there was any notable difference in my listening. Of course, another option would be to go with two 48 volt 10 amp supplies, but it appears there's going to be little difference with that configuration either. But if you're the person who wants to push these to the limit, the option's out there for you. Diminishing returns be damned, and just give it everything. Why not? And I can honestly say power on these is pretty great too, with the 48 volt 5 amp power supply. On their site, they have the wild 300 watts per channel stat, but keep in mind that's at 10% THD. The great news is at 1% THD, the power is no joke either. 120 watts at 8 ohms and 240 at 4. These results have been independently verified over at the ASR forum with some pretty close results, so check that out if you're looking for more detailed numbers around the performance. Looking inside the V3 Mono, they continued their trend to use more premium components. A 63 volt Nichicon capacitor, German WEMA coupling capacitors, Sumida inductor, as well as ELNA audiophile grade capacitors. Op-amp swappers are welcome here like other products from Fosi. Op-amp swapping isn't for everyone, but it's actually kind of fun to play around with sometimes. I won't say you always get the change in sound for the better, but you can certainly change the sound, and that change may be positive for a lot of people. As always, there's cheap options out there for op-amp swapping that many have success with, as well as more premium designs that you can look into as well. As I mentioned earlier, the entire case acts as a heatsink on these. The 3255 amp chip is mounted on the bottom, separating it from the rest of the board, which is great for keeping some of the heat isolated away from the other components, and allows them to have the chip heatsink attached to the case with thermal paste. And just an FYI, if you take these apart, it's always a cheap and safe bet to replace that thermal paste to keep the optimum heat transfer as well. I could spend the next 5 minutes making up subjective descriptions like oozing mid-ranges and velvety bass and wild things like that, or just keep it simple and give it to you guys straight like I prefer to do. The amp sounds very transparent, really just meaning it's true to the source. It's a clean sound and doesn't suffer from load dependence. As always, your biggest impact is going to be down the line to your speaker pairing. Now that we have the load dependence eliminated, it's actually a lot easier to pair. As the frequency response is tamed, it's no longer a guessing game how the amp is going to behave with various speakers. In many ways, it makes it a lot easier for the buyer and their speaker buying decisions. It's a really amazingly clean sounding amp for the price. I include for the price because yes, you can obviously beat this if your budget is higher. But for what this can offer for this price, it's an incredible deal. And you might have to spend more than you'd expect to get the change you're hoping for. While these amps could previously be vindicated as a useful and cost-effective way to get into audio, or possibly fill a situation like your garage or extra space, it's becoming clear that the advancements from these budget brands are not going to stop anytime soon. It was easier to justify the much more expensive designs, sometimes costing thousands more, when you considered the compromises like load dependency and erroneous power levels and strange quirks. But now it's getting to the point where you really have to think about it. How much more will I have to spend to get a noticeable change in how this sounds? In all honesty, I'm not tossing out my high-end gear anytime soon, but at the same time, I can really appreciate what they're actually doing here. You can't argue with the performance. They're quiet, efficient, and put out far more power than you'd expect from a package of this size. Wrapping this up, all I can say is they left me really impressed, and I have a feeling these will do really well once people start getting their hands on them. Fosi listened to the needs of the community and nearly delivered on everything that was requested. If I had to name 3 highlights with this one, it's probably the taming of the load dependence, then the addition of the XLR input, and finally likely the standby mode for inactivity. There's more things I could mention here, but that's going to depend on your use case. You're obviously going to need to pair these with something as they are strictly amplifiers, and from what I gather, Fosi has something on the way for that as far as a preamp goes. I don't have any details on that one yet, but is likely coming soon. I would hope for something maybe with a sub out, possibly with some filter options, maybe tone controls, a remote, and I don't know, I doubt this one, but maybe a screen. I kind of doubt we'll see a screen, and that's all right if it's priced right. The other obvious option on the horizon is the WEMA Ultra preamp streamer. That'll likely cost a bit more, but should have all the above requests. As for what's next from Fosi on amps, if I had to guess, I think we'll probably see a new V3 version 2 stereo amp that carries the upgrades from the mono over to the stereo design. I think it's safe to say after this, the next phase of the mini amp war has begun. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing. It makes a huge difference to my channel as far as opportunities and getting these videos out to more people. I have a lot of great content on the way, and I look forward to sharing it with you soon. Take care. I'll talk to you later. See ya.